The ancient courtyard trembled beneath the weight of Princess Saraphina's silent storm. The air cracked with invisible force as the young deaf princess stood at the center, her silver hair whipping through the wind created by her own uncontrolled power. There was no sound, no scream, only the violent pressure of psychic energy spiraling outward like a tidal wave. Windows shattered one after another, marble columns split open, and guards clung to whatever they could grasp as the storm intensified. It was the 23rd meltdown in 6 months, and another Nanny highly trained, highly praised, had just been flung across the courtyard by an accidental burst of Saraphina's mind. She ran without looking back, insisting the child was cursed. King Aldrich Vaughan stood firm against the chaos, his ancient power forming a shield around him as he moved toward his daughter. At 8 centuries old, he was feared across the realm. A ruler whose strength commanded nations, yet in this moment he looked helpless. His daughter could not hear his voice, could not sense his calming words, could not understand that he was trying to reach her. Seraphina's violet eyes filled with panic, believing she was hurting him, and the storm doubled in strength. Council members rushed into the courtyard shouting warnings, urging the king to sedate or isolate the child before someone died. Some whispered that she should be confined for years until her powers matured. Others muttered that her instability threatened the entire kingdom. Aldrich rejected them all with a fierce glare, refusing to treat his daughter like a monster. But even he knew she was slipping further into despair, trapped in her silent world with no one capable of reaching her heart. Meanwhile, far from the glittering vampire capital, in a dying human mining town where dust covered every window and hope came rarely, a young maid named Meera collapsed during her shift at the local tavern. Hunger and exhaustion had become her constant companions, and the innkeeper fired her on the spot, throwing her into the streets without mercy. Meera staggered home to the cramped room she shared with her sick younger brother, Thomas, knowing she could no longer afford his medicine. She sold everything except her mother's ring, her last treasure, but even that brought only a few copper coins. Desperation weighed on her like stone as she walked through the fading light of Ashford's alleys. Just when she thought she had reached the end, a pale stranger stepped from the shadows, dressed in fine travel clothes completely out of place in their poor town. He introduced himself as Thurin, a recruiter for a wealthy northern household. His words were oddly formal, his eyes strangely luminous. He offered her a position in a distant estate, urgent work, high pay, food, safety, and shelter for her brother. Meera had every reason to distrust a stranger offering such promises, but hunger, fear, and fading hope pushed her forward. She accepted without knowing her choice would place her in the path of a child, whose loneliness could tear worlds apart, and a king whose power could rewrite destiny, **. The journey to the north felt like a dream Meera had no control over. One moment she was standing in a dusty alley clutching her mother's ring, and the next she was riding in a dark, smooth carriage drawn by horses whose eyes glowed faintly in the moonlight. Thurin sat across from her in silence, his posture straight, his hands folded neatly over a leather satchel. Thomas slept with his head in her lap, his thin body wrapped in the only blanket they owned. Every time the carriage hit a bump, Meera tightened her grip around her brother, terrified that all of this would vanish and she would wake back on the tavern floor. Outside, the human lands slowly faded into unfamiliar landscapes, black forests that seemed to whisper, mountains whose peaks cut into the sky like jagged teeth, rivers gleaming with silver reflections under the cold moon. Only when the air turned sharper and the night grew unnaturally still did Meera realized they had crossed into vampire territory. There was a weight here, an ancient presence that made her heart beat faster. Thurin finally spoke, his voice gentle but distant, warning her that the household they were approaching was not just wealthy, but royal. The employer, he said carefully, was a powerful king. The work would be demanding, the rules strict, and fear would not be tolerated. Meera swallowed hard, wondering what kind of servant they expected, wondering how a poor, ordinary girl like her had been chosen for any of this. When the carriage doors opened at last, Meera stepped into a world that looked like it belonged to another life. The castle loomed above her, towers piercing the clouds. its dark stone lit by hundreds of silver lanterns that burned with cold, bluish fire. Bats circled the highest spires, and carved gargoyles watched her with stone eyes from the rooftops. The courtyard was lined with armored guards whose faces were pale and still, their red eyes tracking her every movement. She clutched Thomas closer as Thurin led them through massive iron gates into the inner halls. Inside, everything was polished marble, deep red carpets, and chandeliers that looked like frozen constellations. Yet beneath the beauty, Meera felt something fractured. A tension pressed into the walls themselves, as if the castle had been holding its breath for too long. A small group of vampires waited at the base of a grand staircase, council members and higher-ranking nobles, their elegant clothes whispering of power. They examined Meera the way some people examined a broken chair, curious, doubtful, faintly disgusted. "This is the human?" one of them asked, eyes narrowing. A woman in layered black robes sneered softly, remarking that she had expected someone at least educated, perhaps with experience, not a girl with rough hands and worn shoes. Their words stung, but Meera kept her head bowed, reminding herself that Thomas needed her to endure this. Then the atmosphere shifted. The air cooled even further as a tall figure descended the staircase with slow, measured steps. King Aldrich Von did not need a crown to be recognized. Power moved with him, dark and heavy, like a storm contained in human shape. His eyes were a burning shade of crimson gold, his hair black as the space between stars, his presence overwhelming. Meera's knees almost buckled when his gaze fell on her, not with contempt, but with something sharper: assessment, desperation, a flicker of hope. "You are the human," he said, his voice deep, calm, and dangerous. It was not a question, but Meera nodded anyway, forcing herself to meet his eyes for a heartbeat before looking down again. The council rushed to object, insisting that she was too weak, too unqualified, too fragile to be near the princess. One man snapped that human minds cracked easily even without psychic storms, that placing this girl near the royal child was madness. Aldrich let them speak, face unreadable, then lifted a hand. Silence obeyed him instantly. "Every expert you have brought me has failed," he said quietly, and the hurt in his tone was more terrifying than any shouted threat. "You offered me qualifications, bloodlines, titles. None of them tried to understand her. This girl may have nothing, except what I truly require now." His eyes shifted back to Meera, a heart that will not run. Before she could respond, a soundless impact shook the castle overhead. The lanterns trembled, and a crack appeared along the ceiling. Meera clutched Thomas as another invisible wave rippled through the hall, rattling the chandeliers. The guards tensed. The council paled. Aldrich's jaw tightened. "She is waking," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. In that moment, Meera understood. The job she had been brought for was not cleaning, not cooking, not ordinary service. They wanted her to face whatever was causing this unnatural storm. They wanted her to walk into the heart of the danger that even seasoned vampires feared. Thurin took Thomas gently from her arms, promising in his calm voice that the boy would be given a bed, food, and medicine. Meera's fingers resisted letting go, but she forced herself to trust that, for now, this was the safest place Thomas had ever been. As the king turned and began to stride up the staircase, he spoke without looking back. "Bring her to the princess's wing," he ordered. Now, each step Meera took through the upper halls felt heavier than the last. The sounds grew stranger the closer they came to the royal child's chamber. Metal groaning. Glass cracking. A faint vibration in the walls like a heartbeat made of thunder. Servants and guards stood far away from a certain corridor, refusing to approach. When they saw Meera being led forward, some stared with morbid curiosity, others with open pity. One whispered, "She lasts 5 minutes." Another said, "If she's lucky." At the end of the corridor stood a set of enormous double doors carved with moons and stars, pulsing faintly with containment sigils. Behind them, the air shivered as if the space itself were afraid. Meera's hands trembled, but she closed them into fists. For Thomas. For survival. For a girl she had never met, who was apparently feared by everyone who claimed to help her. The guards unlocked and unsealed the doors, and a rush of invisible pressure hit Meera in the chest. She stumbled, eyes widening as her mind filled not with voices, but with raw, aching emotion, fear, loneliness, confusion, guilt. It felt like sinking into an ocean of someone else's pain. The doors swung open. Inside, at the center of a shattered, beautiful room, stood a small figure with silver hair tangled around her thin shoulders, violet eyes red from crying. Cracks spiderwebbed across the walls. Broken glass glittered on the floor like scattered ice. The girl's chest heaved, though no sound left her lips. Her hands were pressed tightly over her ears as if trying to block out a world she could not hear anyway. This, Meera realized with a shock that almost stole her breath, was the princess. Not a monster, not a demon, just a terrified deaf child drowning in power she did not understand. As Saraphina's eyes snapped to Meera, another wave of psychic force flared. The guards outside shouted for Meera to get back, to retreat, to run. Instead, the human maid's feet moved of their own accord. She stepped over the shards of glass, ignoring the sting in her solace, until she stood several paces away from the shaking child. Meera's heart pounded. She had no training, no magic, no plan. All she had was a lifetime of being ignored, shouted at, treated like she was invisible. She knew how it felt to not be heard. Gently, slowly, she lowered herself to the floor and sat cross-legged, bringing herself to the princess's level. Then Meera did the only thing she could think of. She lifted one hand and tapped softly against the marble. 1, 2, 3. Pause. 1, 2, 3. A simple rhythm. A heartbeat. A promise. I am here. The psychic storm faltered. Saraphina's eyes flicked to Meera's hand, to the pattern echoing through the floor. For the first time, the overwhelming river of emotion slowed, curiosity cutting through terror. She felt the vibration more than she understood it. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3. Meera kept tapping, steady and calm, even as invisible pressure squeezed her lungs and made her vision blur. Outside, the king and council watched in stunned silence through the half-open doors. Every previous nanny had screamed, begged, or tried to control the princess. None of them had tried to speak through the one sense she still trusted: touch. In that fragile moment, as Saraphina's shoulders lowered by an inch and her power quieted like a sob turning into a breath, the impossible future took its first shape. A human maid and a deaf vampire princess, connected by nothing but trembling fingers on cold stone. The room fell into an unnatural stillness. A fragile quiet held together only by the soft taps of Meera's trembling fingers against the marble floor. The rhythm she created was simple, almost childish, yet it carried something Saraphina had never felt before: safety. The young princess's violet eyes flickered with confusion as the vibrations pulsed beneath her palms. Her breathing, once ragged and uneven, began to slow. For the first time since the storm began, the psychic force around her dimmed rather than rose. Meera watched her carefully, heart hammering in her chest. She did not dare move closer. Any sudden shift might break whatever invisible thread had formed between them. She simply kept tapping steady, patient, offering the consistency the child had been denied her entire life. Saraphina took a hesitant step toward her. The air stopped vibrating. Her small, bare feet crunched over glass shards, yet she did not seem to feel the pain. Her gaze was fixed entirely on the rhythmic tremor beneath her. Meera softened her expression, lowering her eyes to make herself less threatening. In that quiet, Saraphina's powers shrank to a faint hum, like the distant echo of a storm finally beginning to pass. At the doorway, King Aldrich watched with something close to disbelief. His knuckles were white against the doorframe, his breath shallow, as if afraid even to exhale. He had seen war, rebellion, betrayal, centuries of darkness, and none of them had ever shaken him like watching his daughter suffer. Now, witnessing a fragile human girl do what entire armies of specialists could not, his expression shifted from shock to something more dangerous: hope. The council members whispered urgently, some furious, others afraid. Lady Morgan stepped forward, insisting this was nothing but coincidence, that humans were unpredictable and unstable, that the king should intervene before anything went wrong. But Aldrich raised a hand sharply. "Silence," he commanded, his voice low, lethal. "She is reaching her." Even he could hardly believe the words. Inside the room, Saraphina stopped just an arm's length from Meera. Her silver hair fell forward, hiding half her face as she observed the girl with intense, trembling focus. Meera slowly lifted her hand and tapped again. 1, 2, 3. Pause. 1, 2, 3. Saraphina lowered to her knees, mimicking Meera's posture, her tiny fingers brushing the floor uncertainly. Then, with a hesitance that made Meera's chest ache, the princess tapped the floor back. The rhythm was uneven, weak, but it was an answer. A conversation. A plea. Meera's eyes filled with tears she fought to hold back. She shifted the rhythm, slower this time, and Saraphina mirrored her again, concentrating fiercely. The silence between them grew warm instead of terrifying, and Meera realized with a sudden, startling clarity that the child was not wild or dangerous by nature. She was simply alone in a world she could not hear. Surrounded by people who never learned how to speak to her, minutes stretched, like fragile threads as they repeated the simple pattern. The shattered room no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a sanctuary made of broken glass and trembling hope. When Saraphina finally reached out and placed her hand over Meera's, the psychic hum vanished entirely. The storm was gone. The child was calm. Meera's breath hitched as she looked into Saraphina's eyes that now carried trust, a trust born in only seconds but weighted with years of longing. The moment was so delicate that even the air felt afraid to move. Behind them, Aldrich let out a breath he had been holding for far too long. His eyes softened in a way no one in the kingdom had seen in decades. But the room's peace shattered a moment later when a high-ranking councilman strode inside, ignoring Aldrich's warning glance. "Your Majesty, this is dangerous," he began. Saraphina flinched, startled, and a sudden psychic flicker shot toward a chandelier above them. The massive structure trembled violently, glass chains snapping. Meera didn't think she acted. She threw herself over the princess's small body just as the chandelier crashed to the ground behind them, shards exploding like icy rain. Aldrich surged forward, power crackling around him. But it was too late. The human maid had already shielded his child with her own body. Saraphina looked up at Meera with wide, shaking eyes, astonished that someone had protected her without fear. The psychic flicker faded instantly. Meera lifted her head, coughing softly, blood trickling from a small cut on her forehead, but she didn't move away from the princess. She cupped Saraphina's cheek gently, offering reassurance through touch alone. Saraphina pressed into the gesture, desperate for comfort, and something in Aldrich's guarded heart cracked open. The councilman was shouting now, demanding the human be removed immediately, insisting she had endangered the princess. But Saraphina's reaction silenced him. The child grabbed Meera's sleeve with both hands, refusing to let go. Her small fingers shaking with fear that this girl, her first connection, would be taken away. Aldrich stepped forward, and the entire room bowed under the weight of his presence. His voice was quiet, but it rippled with undeniable authority. "No one touches her," he said, eyes burning. "She stays." The council was stunned, horrified, but powerless to disobey. Meera slowly rose to kneel beside the princess, still holding her hand, understanding now that she had crossed a threshold no one had crossed before. Saraphina leaned into her as if she had found the only safe place in the world. And as the shattered light danced across the ruined floor, Meera realized something else. Her life had changed forever. Tied now to a princess who had cried in silence for far too long, the castle had not felt true silence in years. Yet after Saraphina's storm faded, an eerie calm settled over the halls. Servants whispered in corridors, guards exchanged uncertain glances, and the council retreated into frantic meetings behind closed doors. No one understood how a human girl, fragile, exhausted, untrained, had succeeded where the finest minds of the vampire territories had failed. Some called it luck. Others called it danger. But all agreed on one thing. Meera's presence had disrupted the balance of the royal court, and many did not welcome the change. As Meera followed a maid to her temporary chambers, She could feel the eyes on her, cold and assessing. Every noblewoman she passed lifted her chin higher, their disdain like a shadow trailing her steps. In a place where power, bloodline, and psychic heritage defined worth, her existence was an insult, but Meera's mind was fixed only on Saraphina. Even after returning to her room and reuniting with Thomas, now safely resting, fed, and warmer than he had been in months, her thoughts kept drifting back to the silver-haired child, who had clung to her as if she were the last piece of solid ground in a collapsing world. Meera's palms still tingled from the weight of Saraphina's small hands. She lay awake long into the night, replaying the moment the princess tapped back the rhythm, the moment the storm faded like morning fog. It felt unreal yet deeply right, as if she had stepped into a role she had unknowingly carried her entire life. At dawn, a guard summoned her to the princess's wing. This time she walked with purpose, not fear. But as she approached, raised voices echoed from the corridor. The council was arguing again, furious, divided, desperate. "A human has no place near the heir," one spat. "This is a humiliation." Another insisted the girl had used tricks, manipulating the princess with deceit. "Or worse," a third hissed, "she may have stumbled upon abilities she does not understand. Humans are unstable creatures. What if she corrupts the child's mind?" Their words sliced the air like knives. But Meera kept her head high. She had endured far worse insults from far weaker men. King Aldrich stood at the center of the storm, his presence colder than the marble beneath his boots. His deep voice cut through the chaos, forcing silence. "You speak of corruption," he said, "yet all of you have failed her. Not one of you could calm her. Not one of you reached her heart." His gaze swept over them with quiet fury. "This human has done more in 1 hour than all of you have done in 1 year." Lady Morgan stepped forward, eyes flashing. "Sire, sentiment blinds you. The girl's presence is unpredictable. If she falters, the consequences," Aldrich cut her off sharply. "If she falters, I will intervene myself. But until then, she stays." The doors opened, revealing the princess seated on the floor inside her room, waiting. Her small form looked fragile amid the broken glass and cracked walls. Yet her eyes brightened the moment she saw Meera. She stood instantly, reaching out with shy urgency. Meera entered as though drawn by invisible threads, kneeling beside the girl. Saraphina hesitated, then gently took Meera's wrist and pressed their hands to the floor, signaling for the rhythm. Meera tapped softly. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3. Saraphina tapped back, her movements steadier than before. The connection deepened. As Meera worked with the child, she discovered subtle patterns in Saraphina's reactions. When she grew overwhelmed, the psychic current pulsed sharply. When she grew curious, the vibrations softened. When fear rose, the air grew colder. Meera learned to respond before the storms grew too strong, guiding Saraphina's focus to grounding rhythms, gentle touches, and soft light patterns reflected on the marble. The child leaned into her like a flower bending toward sun. They communicated without words, without sound, only with trust, but the royal court grew restless. Rumors spread like wildfire. The human is replacing the council's efforts. The princess listens to no one but her. Even the king watches her differently. One evening, as Meera walked Saraphina through a quieter wing of the palace, a group of noblewomen intercepted her. Their embroidered gowns shimmered like frost, but their smiles were sharp. "You're becoming quite bold," one said softly. "Walking beside the air as if you belong here." Another leaned in closer, voice dripping with cruelty. "Humans don't last long in royal households. Accidents happen." Meera felt her spine stiffen, but before she could speak, Saraphina stepped in front of her with unexpected protectiveness. A faint psychic ripple radiated from the child, warning, not attack. The noblewomen paled and retreated instantly. Meera's heart thundered. She had known the child was growing attached, but she had not realized Saraphina would defend her. The princess then tugged Meera's sleeve, guiding her back toward the safer halls. As they walked, Meera felt something stir inside her, not fear, but fierce determination. Saraphina had chosen her. and Meera would protect that fragile trust no matter what it cost. Later that night, a sudden surge of psychic energy rippled across the castle. Guards rushed toward the princess's chambers, expecting another storm. But when they burst inside, they found Meera kneeling beside Saraphina, holding her hands gently as the child trembled with nightmares. Meera whispered calming rhythms against the floor, and the power receded like a tide. Aldrich arrived moments later, stopping in the doorway as he watched the scene. His eyes softened in a way that unsettled even him. There, illuminated by the faint moonlight, was a picture he had never imagined, his uncontrollable daughter resting safely beside, a human maid who looked at her not with fear or duty, but with genuine compassion. For the first time in centuries, Aldrich felt something within him shift, a quiet warmth, a dangerous hope. Meera looked up briefly, unaware of the emotions crossing his gaze, and returned her focus to Saraphina. And as the little princess leaned her head against Meera's shoulder, Aldrich understood a truth he had been resisting. The human girl was no longer just a servant. She was becoming the center of his daughter's fragile world. Asterisk. The following week unfolded like a delicate miracle. Saraphina's powers, once unpredictable and violent, began to respond more often to Meera's calming presence. The psychic storms still came, but they no longer shattered entire halls. Instead, they flickered like brief flashes of lightning, dangerous, yes, but not devastating. Every success made the bond between Meera and Saraphina stronger, and every moment the princess leaned into her. Every time she chose Meera over the countless nobles vying for influence, the court grew more hostile. Some hid their jealousy under polished smiles. Others whispered in corridors or glared openly as Meera passed. They hated that a powerless human girl, made from a dying mining town, now held the key to the kingdom's most precious child, but there were others whose motives were far darker. One night, Meera felt a strange chill while walking back from the princess's chamber. The torches flickered violently, though there was no wind. Shadows thickened unnaturally in the corners of the hallway. Just as she reached for her door, a hand clamped around her arm and yanked her backward. A cloth covered her mouth. The world spun. She tried to scream, but the sound never escaped. The last thing she saw was a pair of red eyes glinting, not with vampire elegance, but with feral cruelty. Deep under the castle, in an abandoned wine cellar, rival nobles huddled around her unconscious form. These were families who feared the princess's future, families who believed Saraphina's power would destroy the hierarchy they worshipped. They saw Meera as the catalyst, the key to an uncontrollable destiny. Without the human, the princess collapses, one whispered. Without the princess, the king weakens. And without the king, the throne is ours. They planned to leave Meera far from the palace, buried under a fabricated accident, ensuring Saraphina returned to the volatile state that terrified the realm. But they had miscalculated one thing: Saraphina's bond. The moment Meera went missing, the princess woke in her bed with a jolt, hands clutching her chest. She could not hear, but she felt the sudden emptiness like a blade through her mind. The psychic shockwave she released tore through the palace like a thunderclap of silent agony. Guards staggered. Glass shattered. Wines burst from their barrels in the lower floors. Aldrich, who had been in a council meeting, felt the blast ripple through his bones. His heart dropped. Meera, he whispered. It was not a guess. It was certainty. He sprinted through the halls as the palace alarm sounded. Servants rushed out of rooms, trembling. The council gathered in panic. Saraphina stood in the middle of her chamber, shaking violently, eyes glowing with violet flame. The air around her warped with raw psychic force. The moment Aldrich stepped inside, she launched herself toward him, grabbing his sleeve, her gestures frantic. She could not speak, but her terror was unmistakable. She felt Meera's fear. She felt her pain, and Aldrich, the ancient king who had survived centuries of war, experienced something he had not felt in over 500 years. True fear. He cupped his daughter's face gently, trying to anchor her mind, but the truth had already settled between them. If Meera died, Saraphina's unstable power would erupt into a catastrophe the entire kingdom might not survive. He called his guards, his voice turning deadly and resonant. "Seal the gates. Search every hall. I want the traitors alive." His command echoed through the palace. Meanwhile, Meera regained consciousness in the cellar, bound and surrounded by shadows. Her head throbbed, her vision blurred, but she recognized danger long before she saw the faces. One of the nobles approached with a knife, slow and deliberate. "Nothing personal," he whispered. "The kingdom simply cannot risk you empowering that creature." His words were cut short by a quake that rattled the ceiling. Dust rained down. Then another quake hit, stronger than the first. The walls trembled like an earthquake had struck the palace itself. The noble froze. "What is that?" Meera's heart pounded, but she knew. She felt it. Saraphina was coming. Above, the castle shook with psychic force as the princess stormed through corridors. Guided only by her connection to Meera, guards followed helplessly behind her. Doors burst open at her approach. Lights flickered madly. The air vibrated with a silent scream powerful enough to fracture stone. Aldrich found her at the entrance to the cellar. The doors blasted off their hinges as Saraphina surged forward with raw power. She descended the steps like a storm of emotions: fear, anger, desperation. When she saw Meera tied to a post, something inside her shattered. Her powers erupted in a violent wave that sent the conspirators crashing into walls, unconscious before they hit the ground. The ropes binding Meera snapped apart. Meera collapsed forward, only to be caught in Saraphina's trembling arms. The princess pressed her forehead to Meera's chest, clinging to her as psychic tremors rippled around them. Meera wrapped her arms tightly around the child, whispering soothing rhythms against her back. The storm dimmed, then faded entirely. Aldrich arrived moments later, breathing hard, eyes burning with fury and relief. The sight of Meera bruised, cut, and shaking made something violent rise in him. He knelt beside them, his hand hovering over Meera's shoulder, steady but gentle. "You're safe now," he said, voice lower than she had ever heard. "Both of you." Meera looked up, exhausted, but managed a fragile nod. Saraphina's face was buried against her, small hands gripping her clothes as if letting go would destroy her. And in that moment, as Aldrich watched the two most important lives in the kingdom tremble in each other's arms, he finally understood the truth the elders had refused to accept. Meera was no ordinary human dot. She was Saraphina's anchor, her shield, her heart. And perhaps without meaning to, she had become Aldrich's hope as well. The castle remained shaken long after the conspirators were dragged away in chains. Guards rushed through the corridors restoring order. Council members whispered in fear, and the nobles who once mocked Meera now avoided her gaze entirely. But none of that mattered in the dimly lit healing chamber where Meera sat on a cushioned bench, Saraphina curled tightly in her lap. The princess refused to be separated from her. Her small hands clung to Meera's sleeves with iron determination. Her face pressed against Meera's chest as if afraid she would disappear again. Even the healers hesitated each time they approached, unsure whether tending to Meera would provoke another psychic wave from the child. King Aldrich stood a few steps away, watching the two with a grave, unreadable expression. The sight of Meera's bruises made something cold and dangerous simmer beneath his calm exterior. Ancient memories of battles and betrayals flickered in his mind, yet none pierced him as deeply as seeing the human girl injured because she had tried to help his daughter. He approached slowly, lowering himself to one knee beside them. "Meera," he said quietly, his voice softer than she had ever heard. "You have endured more in one night than any of my council has in a decade. If you wish to leave this palace after today, no one will question you." Meera looked down at Saraphina, at the trembling child who had fought through stone walls to reach her. She gently stroked the princess's hair. "How can I leave her?" she whispered. "She needs someone. Someone who sees her." Saraphina tightened her grip as if understanding every word. Aldrich exhaled, relief and something warmer flickering through his eyes. "Then you may stay," he said, but the words held a weight beyond duty. "Not as a servant forced into danger, but as the one trusted guardian she has chosen." In the days that followed, Meera remained constantly at Saraphina's side. The princess's powers, volatile for so long, began to shift under her guidance. Meera developed new methods, soft light reflections, cloth textures, rhythmic tapping sequences, gentle hand signals that gradually helped Saraphina communicate complex emotions. The castle's atmosphere changed with them. Where once there had been fear, now there was hope. Where there had been silence filled only with dread, now there were faint vibrations of calm and safety. Even the guards who once flinched near the princess found themselves lowering their weapons more often. Meera was building a bridge between Saraphina and the world, a bridge no one else could have imagined, but the most remarkable change began with the king. Aldrich visited often, under the pretense of observing progress. Yet every time he entered the room, Saraphina would reach out for Meera first, and the king's gaze would soften with gratitude he struggled to hide. He watched Meera's patience, her gentleness, her courage. He watched Saraphina nestle against her shoulder, watched her calm storms that had broken the kingdom. And though Aldrich tried to remain the stoic ruler the world expected, something fragile and dangerous grew inside him: admiration, respect, and a quiet affection he had not felt in centuries. One mild evening, Meera took Saraphina to the royal gardens, her first time outside in months. Moonflowers glowed along the pathways, and the night air carried the scent of silver-leaf blossoms. Saraphina walked carefully, fingers curled around Meera's wrist for reassurance. When they reached the fountain at the garden center, the child paused. She stepped forward, placed both hands on the stone edge, and looked back at Meera with questioning eyes. Meera smiled gently. "Go on," she encouraged, tapping the stone in a simple grounding rhythm. Saraphina touched the water's surface and watched the ripples with wonder. Aldrich emerged moments later, drawn by the faint psychic pulse of his daughter's joy. He froze at the sight, Saraphina standing peacefully beside the fountain, water glittering around her hands, Meera kneeling nearby with a patient smile. It was such a simple image, yet one he had never dared hope for. A world where his daughter could feel safe. A world where she could breathe without fear. Meera looked up as he approached. Their eyes met, and for a moment the world around them softened. The king's guarded expression fell away, replaced by quiet sincerity. "You have given her a life she never had," he said. "And you have given me something I thought I lost long ago." Meera lowered her gaze, warmth rising in her cheeks. "I only did what anyone with compassion would do." Aldrich shook his head gently. "No," he said. "Many had the chance. All of them failed. Only you saw her." Before either could say more, Saraphina stepped between them. She placed one small hand on Meera's arm, and her other hand on Aldrich's, and she closed her eyes. A faint glow shimmered around her. Meera felt a gentle vibration in her mind, like a whisper not spoken aloud. A single word formed, fragile, warm, filled with longing. "Mother." Meera gasped softly. Aldrich's breath caught. Saraphina opened her eyes, looking up with tears shimmering in their violet depths. She had spoken not with sound, but telepathy, her first true word. And she had chosen Meera. Tears blurred Meera's vision as she pulled the princess into her arms. Saraphina clung to her with fierce desperation, as if declaring to the world who she belonged to. Aldrich, overwhelmed, placed a trembling hand on his daughter's back. He looked at Meera with a depth of emotion he could no longer hide. "She has chosen you," he whispered. "And so have I." The following morning, the council gathered for what they believed would be another crisis meeting. Instead, Aldrich announced a new decree. Meera would remain permanently in the royal household, not as a servant, but as the princess's official guardian, her anchor, and her chosen family. The nobles protested, but Saraphina stepped forward, took Meera's hand, and unleashed a psychic ripple so sharp it silenced every room. Respect swept the hall like a storm. No one dared question the princes again. By evening, the castle seemed transformed. For the first time in years, laughter silent, soft, but real filled the princess's chamber. Aldrich stood beside the door, watching Meera and Saraphina practice gentle hand signals under moonlight. He felt a peace he had not known in centuries. A new future was forming, painful, beautiful, unexpected. And as Meera glanced up at him, their eyes meeting in quiet promise, Aldrich understood that this was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of their new family, born from silence, rebuilt through kindness, and bound by a love stronger than any power the kingdom had ever known.